All right. How's everybody doing after lunch? Good spaghetti, feeling good, lively, awake? All right, cool. So my name's Carthele. I work with Ryan at LeadGenius, and I manage our sales team, both on the SDR front and then also our mid-market account executives. Today we're going to talk about outbound emailing, just a high-level agenda, give you some brief background on what I've been up to for the last 12 months in my story, go over some best practices, take a look at some useful tools and technology, and then talk a little bit about execution and wrap it up with some key takeaways and then open it up for any questions at the end. So high level, my background, I started out in the pharmaceutical consulting industry. Then in that, I learned that I wanted to try and do sales, even if that was just a short term. I felt like it would be a valuable skill set to have, regardless of where my career ended up. So I transitioned into medical device sales. I did that for a few years and then moved out here and started my career in technology sales. I was in the healthcare space, and then I've been at LeadGenius for the last 3 years now. Over the last 12 months, really what my focus has been, at LeadGenius, we were historically relying heavily on inbound, which is a common trend that you'll see at a lot of startups. You'll have your referrals, friends, family, and then you kind of hire a marketing person, and that inbound will start to come, and you rely on that. But once you reach a certain threshold, you'll want to start to do outbound. So we didn't have an outbound process in place. We wanted to build that. So over the last 12 months, I've scaled out our SDR team and outbound team from 0 to 7 people. We've generated over 500 plus opportunities, which is equivalent to a little over 10 million in pipeline. And then the one thing that I'm proud of, and I'd love to take credit and say it was all me, but I do have a great team as well. But consistently over the last 11 months, our trending response rate is at 15%. So Ryan earlier talked a lot about focusing on how much you can actually do, making sure that scale it down. This graph here I wanted to show just to talk about. You have your total addressable market. We're all familiar with that, which is how big is the universe of potential buyers for your particular product. Then you have your target market, which is who are going to be the most likely buyers now. And then you'll see the smallest of the bubbles is founder outreach. And I really just put this up here for scale. I think we all have a tendency to, you're kind of always running, you're starting a company in a hurry, want to install this cool technology that's gonna automate things, but you should really try to focus on and hone in, laser focus on a small segment that you can actually have a meaningful test and actually learn from. And then Ryan touched upon making sure you don't want to burn your total addressable market. If you find 1,000 prospects that meet that and just blasting out an email to them, you should really think about, all of your competitors have access to this similar technologies. They're reaching out to these folks as well. So rather than being the first to reach out to them, think about how are you going to differentiate yourself from when your competitors messaging that same person. Just a few insights as far as industry averages. At the end, I have some resources that you can check out. There's a lot of content out there around what are industry averages for response rate, number of touches. So a few here, you'll see response rate. Average response rate that you'll see with outbound emailing is generally between 3 to 6%. Typically, you'll see as far as the number or the specific touch point that somebody will respond to you. That's usually the 4th or 5th touch. Historically, that's what we've seen. It's actually the 4th touch in our case, that's where we have the highest response rate. So making sure that when you actually implement a campaign, that it's not 1 email, it's not 2 emails, making sure that it's 5 to 7 touches over a defined time frame. And don't be disappointed if after you implement that at the start you don't have a ton of replies from your first message. One of the things that's really helpful and that I've implemented with our SDR team is making sure that you have a defined cadence. You all are founders of companies, you're extremely busy, your time is valuable. So some things that you can do, some best practices that really helped us were making sure that you block off time on your calendar. So pick a specific day of the week. It sounds really trivial, but when you're trying to juggle all these different aspects of your business, meetings, all those things, it really helps to just get back to the fundamentals and basics. So cadence would be the cadence of what you're going to do your outreach to these prospects. So you have a cadence, which I will jump to and show you on this slide here. But looking at, okay, on Mondays and Tuesdays, that's when I'm going to do my new prospect outreach to new accounts or contacts that I haven't engaged with. On Wednesday and Thursday, I'm going to be spending an hour doing research on those prospects. And on Fridays, we'll have a circle up as a group to talk about insights or knowledge gained. Does that answer your question? Some of the things to think about when you're looking at the cadence are going to be, I mentioned blocking time off on your calendar, but the number of touches you're going to have for a given prospect. Is it going to be 3 touches? Is it going to be 5? Is it going to be 7? Is it going to be 8? There's not a right answer. I think 40 touches might be wrong, but you should test and iterate to see what the number of touches is. Again, I talked about the industry averages being between 5 to 7. But that's definitely something that you want to think about. Also, the time frame of how long a specific sequence or cadence is going to go for. So we're going to reach out to the VP of engineering, and we're going to have a 6-touch sequence that's going to go over a 45-day period, or a 60-day period, or a 30-day period. And then the frequency of touch is just specifically the duration of time between that first email and that second email, the duration of time between the second and third touch. This is a great example. It's a little complicated, probably for an organization that's gonna, you have 10 to 20 reps. But this is from InsideSales.com. Actually, they had a great blog post that looks at different types of sequences and scheduling, and so it includes both activities on day 1, day 2, day 3, but also the types of activities. Is it a manual email? Is it an automated email? Is it a phone call? Is it a social touch? So you can do this easily on a spreadsheet, but making sure that kind of start to think about how am I actually reaching out to these folks and what are the different touch points that are included. And when you start to look at manual email versus automated email, you can really back into how much of your time you're actually spending and really look at it from an ROI standpoint. Is it valuable to spend 20 minutes writing a custom email versus having it automated? So you look at the response rates and the traction that you get from those. Earlier we talked about personas, getting an understanding of your ideal customer profile. Something that you want to do once you have those, when it comes to messaging, bucketing those personas. So thinking about what is the source that you found this person that you're going to reach out to? Is it outbound? Is it a referral? Is it a friend? Is it somebody from your network of 500 startups? These are all useful things that you can utilize in your messaging. Think about their role. Are they an executive? Are they a founder like yourself? Are they a VP, a manager? Where do they sit at in the organization? What department are they in? The language that you want to use with a salesperson is going to be different than the language that you want to use with a marketer versus a VP of engineering versus a founder. And then the big thing is having a clear call to, CTA or call to action. Those can be things like asking for their time. That's one of the most common ones. Asking for a referral. Asking for an introduction to the right person. But having that clear call to action is something that's really important. I threw this in here. This is an example of Ryan talked about BANT, some different methods of qualification. In this case, we wanted it to be memorable, so that's why it's BA Stud, or for the girls on our team, BA Studette. But this is an example of a real example of how we look at qualifying our customers. So there's things like obviously budget, pricing economics in our case are does it make sense from an ROI standpoint? For us, if you're selling a $10 solution, like the number of deals that you would have to close, given the price point that we are at in the market, it just doesn't make sense. The assumed pain. This is rather than the reason that it's assumed is because oftentimes when you're talking with a prospect or you're reaching out to them, what they say is their pain isn't really their pain. So making sure to actively listen and understand what is that assumed pain. They told us that we need more leads, we need to work on segmenting our market. But in reality, it might be that their main goal is they need to increase conversion rates. So how does your solution address and align with that specific pain? Sales IQ in our case is an indicator of how forward thinking is that person? Are they aware of a lot of the tools in the space? Have they already used those? If they have already used those, we found that that's an indication that they're going to have a higher likelihood of converting. And then some things like total addressable market, urgency, and whether or not they're the decision maker. As far as best practices, general rules of thumb, you're probably aware of a lot of these, but keep it concise. We all have our inboxes flooded. You want it to be short, 2 to 3 paragraphs max, and I'll walk through some examples in a little bit of good emails and bad emails. A big thing is making sure it's measurable. It's one of the last things that we think about. We're data-driven in many aspects of the business, but when it comes to our outreach efforts, our messaging, things like that, we have a tendency to not be as data-driven. So making sure that it's measurable, making sure that you have a clear goal. We talked about that defined cadence and then the clear call to action. Asking for their time, feedback, introduction, or a referral. This is an example message that actually doesn't have there's not a hard call to action, but I wanted to bring it up because you don't always have to ask for somebody's time or for a meeting. Oftentimes what resonates with people when you speak with them or you speak to them directly to their pains and offer them insights that are relevant to their industry that they don't already know. So in this case, this is a vendor that's following up with me. And a few things to point out are, one, the structure of the email. If you just put this all in one paragraph, the person's less likely to read it. Having bullet points seems simple, but it's more friendly to the user. They're more likely to read it all. And it's just like, it opens up. I thought you might enjoy this piece on pipeline management and how it relates to accurate forecasting. And then touches on a few of the relevant points from this article, includes the article. You'll see there's not an ask here. It's hope you're having a great quarter. Did I reply to this email immediately? I didn't, but I eventually reached out to this person about a month later because to me, they're coming across as somebody that understands me as a buyer, the pains that I'm having, and they're aware of relevant content. So as an organization, you're in different industries, but if you can find content that doesn't have to be from your website, but valuable content that's going to speak to the individual buyer, that's going to offer them something that they don't know, that's a really good strategy that can help increase your response rates. As far as does anybody think it's really easy to come up with messaging, or do you find it challenging? Just show of hands. Challenging, easy, challenging? Yeah, it's like, I think of it a little bit like if you were a blogger and you're writing content, like it's not easy to sit down on the spot, craft a really good email. This is an example messaging exercise that we share as a team in a spreadsheet, and it allows us to at different time periods to go in and maybe you come across a piece of good content and you can add that in. But the way that we break it up is you'll see there's the specific sequence number. In our case, if you're sharing it with multiple people, who's the owner of this sequence that we're going to roll out? The title, number of steps, we talked about a cadence, the duration in terms of days, who's this going to, who's the target audience, the relevant titles, the problem. And then there's a few more here where we're looking at what is the solution, what is the sequence value add or highlight, and then having a primary or secondary call to action. And then you'll see the last point there is if you're going to include any content, you can add that in as well. We found this is a useful exercise to help us continuously iterate upon our messaging and sequence, give feedback to each other, comment on those, and ensure that it's an ongoing iterative process when it comes to messaging. What worked 6 months ago doesn't work as well today. So making sure that you've got a good structure and forum in place to continue to build upon that messaging. As far as where do I go, what do I look for, what do I research to actually build a really good email? This is a great graph that came from Engagio, which is an outreach tool. But thinking about the different areas you can research or you can pull content from. You can look at the market. What are the industry dynamics? What are the key trends? What are their competitors doing? You can look at relationships and connections. Who are the key profiles? What are some of the relationships that you have to that organization? The company itself. What are their goals? What's their financial health? Are they growing? Do they have that relevant problem that your solution could speak to? And then I included an example email here that touches upon 3 of those different buckets. So you'll see touches upon the relationship. So this is an email that we had sent to someone at LeadGenius. I had an interaction with the prospect. My colleague leverages that I interacted with that prospect and that we had a good conversation. And then you'll see that he also attended one of their conversations. So he attended a talk where the CEO and the VP of sales were talking about their growth initiatives. And he talks about, I can imagine having that many users makes it easy to direct your resources towards internal expansion versus outbound. Essentially what he's speaking to is, if you're familiar with LeadGenius, they had a freemium model, and this talk was about how our freemium model, or 30 million freemium users, led to our enterprise sales strategy. And so he's touching upon a real pain, relevant pain that they have, whereas a freemium model, they're dealing with a ton of inbound inquiries, and then from a sales side, the problem is, how do you segment and prioritize that? So when you think about this as like a standard email that's just reaching out to somebody, this has a lot more substance to it. As far as strategy goes, I talked about making sure it's measurable. How are you going to track it? And then what does success look like? Some example KPIs. You might be aware of some of these, but number of contacts engaged, looking at it on a daily basis, looking at it on a weekly basis, looking at it on a monthly basis. If it's just you and 2 other founders, think about your time frame, how many resources you have, and pick a reasonable number that you can reach out to and set that goal that you're going to reach out to them on that time frame, whether it's a monthly basis, quarterly basis. How many touches do you have, and how many touches does it take to get a response? Looking at that both on an individual basis and across your team. What is your trending open rate? What is the trending response rate? What is the trending number of meetings set? And then if you're looking at from meeting set, how many opportunities did you create? And what this next slide here looks at is you start to develop actual funnel metrics that you can back into. So in our case, looking at a quarterly basis, we wanted to reach out to 150 target accounts, roughly 1,020 contacts, and we have these assumed metrics in our case that were based off of historicals. The one thing I want to note, you'll see 20% response rate. Earlier you mentioned that industry averages are 3 to 6%. The reason why is because we're looking at this response rate utilizing an account-based approach where we're touching between 10 to 12 contacts at an organization. So when you utilize that approach, you generally would expect to see a higher response rate than you would against industry averages. And yes, so utilizing an approach where we're reaching out to, it's an average of 8 contacts at an organization. Not just 1 or 2. And it involves both sales, the SDRs, it involves the account executives themselves, it involves our executive leadership, and it involves marketing. So we would divvy up, we find 12 different contacts at a large organization that are either the decision makers or in the realm of decision makers, and marketing is responsible for retargeting against 50% of those. Our enterprise, good? The question was, how do you tailor messaging to one person versus another? Some of the things that we would look at are, earlier I had the slide that was looking at where do they sit in the organization? Is it a executive level? Is it a VP level? Is it a manager or director level? Or is it an individual contributor? You can start to craft messaging along those lines, and then also looking at what department they sit under. So if they're in marketing, your language is going to be a little bit different than if they're in sales. If you're reaching out to a VP of engineering, that's going to be slightly different. And then the messaging, whether it's from the SDR or from the account executive or from the founder, that remains relatively aligned for us. Just making sure that we have a consistent theme and that we're speaking, we're kind of marching in alignment in terms of what our value proposition is and how we can potentially help that customer. The question was, the call to action is to set a meeting. What happens if the CEO gets a response versus the account executive? Does that CEO actually go onto the meeting? So if it's on behalf of the founder, we will try to have them attend the meeting. But generally, when it's a founder, your time is really valuable. So if they can't attend it, we'll oftentimes make an introduction to one of our colleagues. So if you're reaching out and you get a response, but you don't have time, making sure that in your reply, you CC one of your other founders so that, hey, I also wanted to introduce you to my co-founder, so-and-so, who will be attending the meeting as well. And then you can kind of handle it from there if you're able to make it. That's great. If not, then it's not. They're not totally blindsided. Yes, exactly. It's not like we would be reaching out to 8 to 12 contacts today. These would be tiered. We would. I have on here bucketing them by tiers. So as far as accounts, there's your top tier accounts. This kind of helps to align your strategy, and then reaching out to 2 to 3 contacts. And there's really 2 ways that you can do it. You can reach out to them and let them know or make them aware of the fact that you reached out to their colleagues. Or alternatively, you're reaching out to them in a similar time frame, say 2 to 3 contacts. It comes back to what's manageable for you. Would it be manageable to reach out to 8 contacts at one account? It wouldn't. And you also want to make sure that inevitably you're going to prospect out to folks. And then a certain number are going to respond. But a large majority, call it 70 to 80%, you're not going to get a response from. That doesn't mean that the account itself is deemed dead, so to speak. That's when you start to cycle through those next batch of contacts. This is a breakdown of, so if you have it broken down by tiers, you'll see some things here. Number of contacts engaged. So tier 1 might be, you pick 5 of the, these are slam dunk accounts. These are the best people that you want to reach out to. So you're willing to spend the most amount of resources of your time to engage with those folks. You want to engage with a greater number of contacts. Inevitably, if you're engaging with more contacts at a given organization, your brand's going to have more exposure. They're going to be more aware of it, and so you're going to increase the likelihood of getting a response. So you select your number. It could be 5, maybe it's 2. But tiering that out. So we have 12 contacts engaged at the tier 1. Tier 2, there's 8 contacts. Tier 3, there's 5 contacts engaged. And then you'll see a breakdown of the touches per contact, 10, 8, 8. And in our case, you could just be doing email. You could segment this by manual touches versus automated touches. It's going to be 2 manual touches and 4 automated touches. If you're integrating calling within your outbound strategy, how many of those, what percentage of those are going to be calls versus emails versus social? There's multiple channels. I would encourage you all to utilize all those, especially we've seen a lot of success leveraging social. So you're on LinkedIn, reaching out to that person on LinkedIn or liking a piece of content that they have. Those are all different types of touch points. So the 10 touch points, that's over a 60-day period. Generally, we have our timeframes between a 45 and 60-day period at the individual contact level. And then you think of it, you've engaged with this person between 6 to 8 times over a 45 to 60-day period. Either you get a response. If you don't get a response, they go into a cooling phase, and then you engage with another contact that could be a relevant decision maker. And then applying those funnel metrics that I showed earlier to get a sense for how much work you're going to actually have to do. We all think that, I'll work all night. I can reach out to 1,000 companies. We need to hit a certain number. But inevitably, it's just numbers. It backs into how many hours there are in a day, how much time you're spending doing prospecting, And so in this case, if we're reaching out to 150 contacts, 1,000 or 150 accounts, 1,020 contacts, you'll see I have the inputs with the reply rate, positive reply rate, reply to meeting set, meetings held, and then that first discovery to conversion. And there's actual volume numbers to that. So if we're reaching out to these folks over a 30 to 45 day time frame, we're going to expect roughly this many replies. How many minutes does it take you to handle that reply? Does that, when you add it up to how many hours is that on a given day that you're spent dealing with replies, does it make sense? Is that manageable? So when I talk about making sure it's measurable and making sure that you have a defined cadence, this is a little bit of what I'm talking about here. As far as the technology landscape, looking at two aspects here. One are email tools that can help you do this. The ones at the top are ToutApp and Yesware. Is everybody familiar with those two tools? We talked a little bit about Yesware. Yes? Those are great as a founder. Those are great, inexpensive tools that you can have an individual license on that I would highly recommend to utilize. They have the functionality that you need to track, to be able to see the email opens, to be able to see how many people, what's your response rate, to have a structured place where you can have templates that you share with your 2 or 3 other founders. Some of the ones below are more as you start to grow your team and you're hiring your first sales reps and you have a team of 3 or 5, 10. These are some other tools that are a little bit more expensive, but that I've had experience with. And both Outreach.io is a very incredible, robust tool that allows you to do some really cool things when it comes to actually automating your sequence, but making it customized. So what I mean by that is you can actually set up different profiles, and then based on a profile, pull in different types of content automatically that you're storing. So some cool things like that. Engagio is another cool tool that allows your reps or other individuals on your team to send emails on your behalf. So essentially what that means is maybe your first full-time sales hire sees that you have a connection with another founder at a target account, and they want to draft up an email. It allows you to approve that and then basically send that, so that's sent on behalf of you. This Engagio. And then the scheduling vendors, and I have a few slides that show this. One of the biggest, when it comes to you're emailing back and forth, but then setting the meeting. What's going to drop it off? Oh, you get a reply. What time works best for you? And then you're typing back. How about 3 p.m. or 4 p.m.? If you haven't utilized any tools like Schedule Once, Calendly, Assistant.to is a free tool. We use all 3 actually. Some people prefer Calendly over Assistant.to. And what this looks like is essentially making it easier. There's less friction for somebody to schedule time with you. It's that simple. It's looking at your availability. You can choose when you are available and allow that person to pick a time, and then basically you both get a calendar invite and it's done. So it really helps to streamline the process of once you get that reply, let's make it as frictionless as possible to actually schedule a meeting. Here's my calendar. Pick a time that works. Or you can insert times into an email. Here are the times that I'm available. And it's a nice little widget within Gmail that allows you to pick those times. You can pick the times you're available. And when they click one, again, it will automatically send that invite to both parties, and you have your meeting booked. And then one of my favorite features of Yesware that is the send later functionality. There are some other tools, but what this allows you to do is you're busy during the day, maybe at night. In my case, at night, I'm watching TV, and I'll start to queue up some emails to go out the next day. And you can have those tiered up. You can craft those at night and then click send later and choose the specific time that you want that email to go out. It could be 2 days from now. It could be 3 days from now. If you want it to go, if you're prospecting to folks that are on the East Coast, you want that to go out at 5:30 a.m. Pacific, perhaps. So you can choose those times, and it allows you to be more productive and still have those emails hitting the other person's inbox at the relevant time. And then a few pieces of example content. There's a tendency to automate. Like, there's a ton of tools and technology out there, but when you're reaching out as a founder, it should come across as personalized. So having fancy graphics, like we know what a marketing email looks like when you get one. This was signed off as the individual sales rep, but you know that this is an automated email. So even if he's actually writing to that or customizing to that, you want it to look like an email that you actually wrote. This is an example of a good email that's asking for feedback. We talked about calls to action. It could be an intro, it could be a referral, it could just be for feedback. In this case, it's just an email that explains, next week we're beginning development on our mobile app. Before we get started, we'd like to get a sense of how our target audience use mobile products. They include a survey. Thanks in advance for your help. Like, I spoke with the individuals that sent this, and they got a pretty good engagement rate from sending this email out to existing users that they had an interaction with. In terms of personalization, this is a great example of, I talked about Engagio earlier. This is an example of where you have that personalization that's done by an SDR and it's sent on behalf of someone else on that team. And so one of the things that they're looking at are, okay, common connections. As a founder, I was a founder at Marketo, and I noticed we both know people in common, including Matthew and Mark. So that slide that I had a little bit earlier as far as the trends that the areas that you can look to in order to generate content, whether it's the market, is it relationships? This is a great example of leveraging those relationships and connections. This one, subject line, building your key account list. We've seen good success with asking a question, also with including the individual's first name in the subject line. So, Daniel, is this something that's on your radar? Or Dan, whatever that individual's name is, including that in the subject line. And you'll see, again, leveraging a connection. Ryan, in this case, suggested I reach out to set up a call this week or next. Would love to discuss your 2017 key account list and how we can help source some data. Clear call to action at the end. What's the best way to get 25 minutes on your calendar this week or next? So back to having that clear call to action, whether it's a meeting. And the one thing I would note is when you're reaching out, not asking for a meeting tomorrow, because everybody's really busy. Be conscious of the fact that we're all busy. And so if you're reaching out to somebody cold for the first time, not saying, do you have 30 minutes to chat tomorrow? Because odds are their calendar's probably booked. So be respectful and ask for, do you have 30 minutes to connect over the next 2 weeks? Something like that. This one has, again, a clear call to action. I just mentioned the downside on this. Are you free tomorrow at all or next Tuesday? It's not as clear, and it asks, are you free tomorrow? The thing that I do like about it is that it has the PS line. I assume you're likely swamped since you're in sales. Feel free to pass me off to a colleague at LeadGenius if you need to. So while they do ask for time tomorrow, that PS is also a secondary call to action, which is, hey, you are busy. If you don't have time, is there anybody else that I could possibly speak with? Again, you'll see the subject line. Why Zora for 2017? Question mark. So you want to track your open rates, and you want to ensure that I care personally. I found it response rate is what ultimately matters the most. But when you're running multiple sequences and reaching out to folks, you'll notice trends in your open rate. And an easy way to A/B test that is in the subject line. So keep the body the exact same and make tweaks on the subject line. Some of the tools that I mentioned, they allow you to easily do that. So you have 3 different subject lines, maybe one that has the person's name in it, maybe one that's a question, and maybe one that's not. And then as you start to utilize those, you'll be able to see differences in the response rate and then make a decision moving forward on which of those subject lines gets the best open rate. This is an example of a follow-up email that I got that I thought was Really good touch point. It was light. They gave me a call, so they're integrating calling. Just tried giving you another call. It doesn't have my name in it because we've had exchanges before, but just tried giving you another call to refresh. If you've ever been frustrated over reps neglecting quality leads, seen opportunities slip through the cracks because of slow response rate, or gotten a headache over dirty Salesforce data, we can solve your woes. And the ask is there a better time to call so I don't barge into your day? So it's being respectful, again, of that person's time and really speaking directly to them. And just to recap here, a few of the takeaways. There's not a magic bullet. It's an iterative process, and you'll see this. Things that are working great for 1 month is you get into that next month or 2 months down the road, they won't work as great. So you have to continuously iterate and test. You want to make sure that it's measurable. Present solutions and insights that address the prospect's pain. What are you telling them that they don't know? And is it relevant to their business needs? So understanding that market landscape, understanding where they sit in the organization it's a really key part of being able to actually get that response and get that meeting set, which is inevitably what we all want. Measurable, measurable, measurable. How are you measuring it? How do you define success? What are the KPIs? Because even if you're the worst emailer in the world, if it's measurable, you're going to be able to incrementally improve. You're going to know that your email 1 is slightly better than email 2. And so you go on with email 1, and then you iterate. And then lastly, be authentic. I had a really interesting thing happen where one of the reps on my team was using a sequence, and he was consistently getting around 16% response rate. And he was number 1 on the board in terms of meetings. And so I thought, well, for some of my reps that aren't doing as well, let's replicate that and use the exact same sequence on the exact same time and duration on the same audience, but on your behalf. And something that I found was it didn't result in the same response rate. And I have one of the steps that were in that sequence. It was a little more aggressive. It was abrasive. This was step number 6. And the subject line is, should we continue reaching out? We've done our research, reached out a few times, and offered some free sample lead data and still haven't been able to connect with your team and that bracket just pulls in the company's name. Should we stop reaching out? And so when I say be authentic, the individual that saw success with this is really good at turning negative responses into opportunities and meetings. That's something that his personality, he's good at that. When we ran that with other reps, that wasn't their style. That wasn't how, when they got on the phone with people, the way that they spoke. So at the end of the day, as long as you're authentic, I think that you have a really good chance of establishing some good response rates and being able to overcome objections, whether that's at the initial reply or on the meeting set. And some of those resources, just to wrap it up, Topo is a great resource. If you're looking for what's a reasonable average, what's a reasonable number of prospects to reach out to, you all have different ACVs. So if you're selling to enterprise, how many should you reach out to today versus SMB? How do those response rates change? Topo's a great resource. The Engagio blog, HubSpot's blog has a ton of content. Sales Hacker's another great resource. In the Bridge group, they consolidate a lot of data. They'll basically do annual assessments, both at account executive level and SDR level. So there's a ton of great content out there. These are just a few of those, and I'd highly recommend or encourage you to take a look at some of those if you're looking for some direction and pointers on kind of getting a sense for, are we in the norm of prospects that we're engaging and who we're reaching out to. And other than that, any questions? I kind of flew through that, and I know we're post-lunch. Yeah, so my favorite tool. So my favorite, it's hard to pick one, but as far as email outreach goes, my favorite tool is Engagio. And the reason that that's my favorite is Outreach.io is my favorite. From a team perspective, it gives us, one, they track a lot of analytics. So being able to see how one given sequence is performing or how one given message is performing, and being able to see that at both the team level and at the individual level. So I'm a big fan of that. And then also, as you scale out your team and you're trying to, there's this whole, we want personalization. You need to be personalized. Everybody talks about it. But when you're trying to scale, personalization at scale it's a tough balancing act. And so one of the things about Outreach.io is they give you that flexibility to, what I mentioned earlier, personalize, include some level of personalization, but it's automated. So whether that's by a specific buyer persona or including and pulling in a specific piece of content that's linked to that buyer persona. So those are some of the reasons that we've personally seen a lot of success using that tool. So the question was on what touch do we change subject lines? I'd say the most common one that I would say we A/B test the subject line. The most common one that we do that on is going to be on the first touch. And then generally the later that we get in a sequence, the less A/B testing we're doing on that subject line, just because there's two things that you can do. One is you can have a reply to an existing email, right? But what you want to avoid is make sure you don't have every email be a reply to the existing, because what happens is when you look at your inbox and you see those 6 or 7 messages that might have been over a 45-day time frame, you just see a snapshot. It's like, this guy's emailed me, like it's probably a sequence. So you want to break that up a little bit. And so later in the funnel, or in terms of those touches, we'll mix up whether it's a reply to an existing thread or a subject line. And then it's really pretty easy to A/B test those subject lines. And I'd encourage you to at least do 2 A/B tests so you have a comparison of what is getting the better open rate. And then as you're doing this over time, you can start to see, like, is this in line with what our historical open rate has been? So if your historical on your last outreach sequence is 60%, and you only have one subject line, and you see that, we're only getting a 30% hit rate here, or open rate, because of that historical data, that we should definitely adjust this subject line. So a little bit of it is going to come down to how does that compare to your historicals. Yeah, and so if I'm understanding correctly, the question is, how do I feel? We talked about 10 touches over a 60-day sequence. How about looking at touches over a bigger cohort or longer cohort? So could be 90 days or 4 months. That's something that I'm actually a big fan of, is if you can tie it comes back to your content in the messaging. And if it's going to be over a 120-day time frame, like that's great, but making sure that, one, the duration of what's the frequency of those touches, and then 2, what is that ongoing messaging going to be? Is it related to the last one, or is it just another piece of valuable content? And so if you start to extend it further and further, I think of it as, is this an individual resource at your team, yourself, that you're sending these outreach messages to, or is it more like a marketing ongoing nurturing email? Because if it gets to 6 months or 9 months or 12 months, that, in my eyes, that tends to be a little bit more of what falls under the typical marketing function of brand awareness, making sure that you're in front of those folks. So the question is, as you're over those longer time frames, gaining insights on your persona and perhaps that messaging that you were originally utilizing, do you keep using that or do you scrap it? I think there's a minimum sample size that you want to have that go completely through a given sequence. So you can really pick a number, but say that it's, 50 prospects that are going through this outreach sequence. We want those 50 to go through the full sequence, but there's 100 total that we're reaching out to. After those 50, we feel that that's a reasonable enough sample size that we can then collect data. So in that case, once you reach that threshold, if the data is telling you that, you know what, this we need to adjust this subject line or adjust the messaging and who we're speaking to, I would highly recommend scrapping that. So if tier 1 is 10 contacts, how do we A/B test the subject lines? So it wouldn't just be 10 emails. So it would be, say, 5 to 7 touches across those 10 contacts. Not with the same subject line. So if we're reaching out to the founder at a company, that subject line might be different than if we're reaching out to a manager. So I would think of them in terms of, but looking at it by these lines. So the subject lines are going to be consistent for executive level or VP level. If they're in sales or marketing, keeping those subject lines consistent. But they're not going to, it's not that they're consistent across all of the different personas that you have. So if we're reaching out to 10 contacts and 40% of those are going to be at the VP level and 50% of those are going to be in marketing and 50% are going to be in sales. Those are the two areas where we're going to look at how does that subject line perform at those levels. So for one account, that's 2 VPs of sales, 2 VPs of marketing, that's 4 VPs total. And then in tier 1, there's 10 accounts. So that's across 10 accounts, which would be, what is that, 20. So your sample size is actually 40 for each of those. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you all taking the time to listen to me stand up here and talk about email outreach and all these crazy spreadsheets and stuff. So I'll be hanging out around if anybody wants to talk about their specific process. And yeah, appreciate your time.